Going live. Okay, it says we're live. Okay, welcome to the You Ain't Gonna Need It podcast, or YAGNI for short. This is a podcast and live stream to discuss programming, data science, cloud, careers. Your hosts are Noah Gift and Matt Harrison, authors, instructors, and consultants who try and distill these topics down to the essentials. And so, hey, Noah, how's it going this week?
Pretty good. Just doing probably what a lot of people are doing, and laying low and working on things like projects and anything I can do in the quarantine environment. How about you?
Awesome. Yeah, working on my next book and chatting with a bunch of people about potential collaborations or doing some teaching with them. So excited for that. So if you are if you're following along at home, just give us a shout out if you can hear this on if the audio is working. I hope it is, but we're getting the hang of this, so I hope our audio is working. Okay, so awesome. Well, I think today we wanted to talk about the idea of investing, and a lot of people have been pretty occupied with investing recently because 401k or whatnot is basically gone in the direction they probably didn't want it to. And I guess full disclosure, neither of us is a financial advisor, but we're not going to talk about investing in the stock market. We're going to be talking about investing in knowledge. And so just as sort of an idea to riff on, I've been reading a book called The Pragmatic Programmer. It's a pretty good book. I recommend that people read it if they haven't read it. And there's a section on that talks about investing in technology, or not investing in technology, investing in technological knowledge or your knowledge portfolio. And so Noah and I thought it would be good to talk about that for a couple minutes and just look at the comparisons between investing strategies for money or whatnot versus investing strategies for knowledge. And so there's sort of 5 ideas here, and so we'll just go through them. And the first one is that serious investors invest regularly as a habit. And so again, if you have a 401k or whatnot, ideally you would invest regularly on a monthly or whatever basis into that to build that up. How does that compare to investing in knowledge? What do you think, Noah?
Yeah, I think it's similar. That this is something I teach in pretty much every course that I've designed at the graduate level. Is I talk about creating a learning plan for yourself. So what is your quarterly goal? What's your yearly goal? What's your 5-year goal? And if you don't have a goal for what it is you're trying to learn and have specifically things you're accomplishing each quarter and each year, they just won't happen. And I do agree with this, that if you do want to have a career that's successful in the technology field, unlike some other careers where maybe it's I'm sure it's still important to study and to learn in other careers, but in particular with the technology field, you have to have a regular cadence where you're accomplishing something. And it is, I think, very similar to that concept of an index fund, where if we look at right now, obviously there's a lot of downturn in index funds, but if you invest every quarter, then it really doesn't matter in the long term what happens in the short term. So I do think that's a very good analogy for how people should treat their career in terms of learning.
Yeah, I think that's great. Do you have some ideas or some advice for some goals for investment? I mean, if I was working at a company, I would say, like, take 10% of my salary and put 10% in. So what are examples of goals that maybe you've seen or that you would advise if someone is coming to you and saying, what's a good strategy for me?
Yeah, so it is an interesting topic, because this is something I actually really dig into a lot when I'm working with students. I think that your strategy in a company should be that you should have a 20% time period that you dedicate towards learning new things, that you really cannot count on your company having your best interests in mind. And obviously this is easier to say when all these layoffs are happening, then it's obvious to say, oh, look, my boss really didn't care about me that much, or my company didn't really care me about, or the venture capital firm that invested in my company, they said all these great things and then they laid me off. It's easier to say that you should invest in yourself at now. And so hopefully people will listen, is that it really is in your best interest, in the company's best interest, for you to be constantly upskilling yourself. And even I would say, well, the world may be changed where you don't physically go into an office anymore. But if you, in the old days, I would actually spend maybe the first couple hours at work just learning some new thing that I thought would be helpful to me. And it wasn't necessarily what I was doing in the company. And I think it's
Yeah.
a very good, it's like a counter cycle investment.
Awesome. And the idea of 20%, I think Google had their 20% time when you could work on whatever you want. But I do agree with your point in that if you're under the pretense that a company has your best interest at heart, you probably need to rethink that, because companies have fiduciary duties, and their fiduciary duty typically is to maximize their profit, which isn't necessarily your best interest at heart. And so it can be sort of a hard sell to say, I'm going to spend 20% working on whatever I want. But I mean, I think, like you said, you can be creative about that. And maybe it's deep diving into something that you're working on, right? You might have a cursory knowledge of it, but not a deep knowledge of it. And so I think a lot of times, if you can sort of dive into the stack and get a better understanding of that, that's going to pay off and have pretty big dividends on that. And you can, I think that even be quantified or justified in that you can say, hey, I'm going to really understand how, whatever, if you're working on Node or if you're using TensorFlow, if you understand how the guts work, you'll be able to debug or maybe leverage some things. And so there's an investment up front, but there's a payoff in the end that will make you much more valuable to your company and make you much more valuable to yourself as well. We got a comment here from Matthew Emmerich. Says, I would argue that investing in yourself is a surer bet than anything else, especially if you invest in something low risk, high reward like writing or public speaking. What are your thoughts on that? Investing in writing or public speaking?
Yeah, I would say all that. I would agree that investing in yourself is absolutely the best strategy, and there's low risk. I mean, if you can't bet on yourself, who can you bet on? And then I would agree as well that writing, public speaking, communication, these are all really important skills that are only going to help you if you come across as knowledgeable. You can present things well, you can articulate things. It's only going to help you in your career. And in addition to just kind of take that comment plus go back onto what we were talking about, I think there's a concept of that's important to call out here, which is not doing what you're told. I think it's important to do a great job at your job and fulfill your obligations, but also simultaneous to that, have a strategy of intentionally not doing what you're told. So your boss may again have all these really awesome ideas about how Oracle is going to conquer the world and your company should go deep into Oracle and they want you to do Oracle. Great. You should also almost do the opposite a little bit in what you learn. And so I think that's part of the counter, like hedging your bets strategy, is it try to intentionally don't do what you're told. Don't listen necessarily to what your company says about what you should study, what you should learn. Find something that's opposite so that you can hedge against what your company is doing. Because again, let's say I'm just randomly picking Oracle, but let's say your company is way deep into Oracle Cloud, it's going to be the best. And then you're laid off. Well, where are they now? They're not going to help you continue to go deep on Oracle. But if simultaneous to that, You were actually saying, oh, you told me to study Oracle. Well, I'm going to certainly do a good job at this, but I'm also going to study AWS cloud, Azure cloud, and GCP cloud. Turns out that now if you're fired, you're in great shape because you've actually intentionally disobeyed your leaders. So I think that's a very important thing to think about in investing in yourself, is to have a slight bit of disobedience that's constantly there, and keep it active.
Awesome. Yeah, and that somewhat leads to the next point that they make in the book here, and that's diversification, and the idea that diversification is a key to long-term success. So similarly, if I was just going to buy whatever, Tesla or whatnot, it might do well for a while, but right now no one's driving, so it might not do well. But if I've diversified, then I don't have all my eggs in one basket. And I think similarly to what you just said, if you're solely, I'm an Oracle person, I think there's value in niching down, but I know a lot of Oracle people who now are Postgres people, right? Or MySQL people, because the market has changed. And so, hedging your bets and being able to understand maybe the competition or what something else is doing is a great way to, I guess, dive into your product further and see where the pros and cons of it are, and also understand what are some of the other strategies that you might be able to leverage as well. You have any thoughts on diversification?
Yeah, kind of, in basically, I guess I got there a little bit early, but that's part of the strategy, is to find ways to disagree intentionally with what your company is doing, do the opposite, and also to look at things that potentially are in the future that are outside even of the friends that you have. So, I've been doing Python for a couple decades now, and I think I'm also worried that's the only thing that I would be investing in. So that's why I've really been intentional about doing things in other languages. So I've done a lot of work in C#. I've done a lot of work in Erlang, JavaScript. I've done things where I feel comfortable in another language, completely working as a software engineer. I think that's another one. Whatever language you're in, whatever technology you're in, also try to actively find friends and people that are almost against what you're doing, and find out what they're passionate about and study some of that, because there's nothing worse than blindly believing what someone tells you about whatever thing you're in. It's a great way to really get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, if you're just following the monothink, right, and everyone's has the same thoughts, you might miss the boat. If you're so heads down in investing in one section, you might miss something going on in another place as well. As an example, one of the things that I do that's somewhat similar to that, I mean, I've also programmed in a lot of languages. Right now, I do a lot of data science, machine learning, predictive modeling, that sort of thing. And so I don't use R per se, but I actually go to the R user groups or listen to the R user groups, because I want to see what other people who are doing similar types of work, the tools that you're using, how they're using them, see if are there things that I can leverage from that, or understand how they're doing things better than what I'm doing as well. Okay, awesome. Let's see here. We got another comment in LinkedIn. Russell says, as long as you can maintain objectivity, I would agree. If one is subject to any form of subjectivity, there are big risks aligning to emotional driven data rather than logical driven data. Yeah, and I think Russell's point is, similar to what we've been saying, right? If you're solely focused on one thing, you need to sort of check in the blinders or check what you're missing. And I like your idea of sort of going against the grain somewhat. I mean, that might sound a little harsh. How would you sell that to a boss, right? Like they say, well, I'm going to do the exact opposite of what you told me to. Do you have any ideas or tips for someone? Because I mean, if you're offering that advice, someone might take it literally, and they might say, well, Noah told me to do the opposite of what you say. So maybe how would you maybe grease the skids of that a little bit easier?
Well, I think it's a good skill to be there, to actually not always speak truth to power. So power and competence are not necessarily related. And I think there's some very obvious current examples of this. And just because your boss is your boss doesn't mean that they're smarter than you, they know more than you. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But a lot of times when you're, they basically have the control over your salary, you may not want to tell them everything that you're thinking. Some of it, keep it to yourself. And obviously you have a good relationship with your boss, do a good job. But I think having your own agenda, that's a multi-company agenda. This is something I also tell students is think about your career in terms of like a layer on top of companies, not like your company, but have a layer on top. And that's really what you should be thinking about is how do I get to my goals where I'm actually multi-company, I have a strategy. And so it could be the case where you really just don't tell your boss everything you think. And that's probably one of the best pieces of advice I could give someone, period, just about anything is in a way like being, very professional and concise is, and not being friends with your boss is probably just generally a good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, and not necessarily that you shouldn't be friendly to them or whatnot or cordial to them, but
Just professional, just keep
yeah,
it
be
professional.
professional. I mean, I have had good friends that were bosses, and I've had good bosses there. Okay, the next one is smart investors balance their portfolios between conservative and high risk, high reward investments. What would be an example of a conservative investment and maybe a high risk, high reward investment? Is a high risk, high reward learning the next JavaScript framework?
Yeah, it's a good one. A good example, I guess, I have in my career is that I was a little bored of Python, just kind of sick of it, and I picked a very high risk, high reward language to build an entire company on, and we spent years doing it, Erlang. And I think that it didn't pan out. That if I'm really honest with myself, it was probably not a good choice because of the fact that it wasn't big enough,
Hard
but
to
it could have
hire.
been. It's hard to hire. That was the biggest thing. It's hard to hire. And then even worse is that people talk about vendor lock-in, which is really, I think, one of the silliest things that you can possibly talk about, because you know what's worse than vendor lock-in is work. And I've had lived this is you're working in an obscure language like Erlang, and then you basically are subject to the mercies of mercurial developers plus whatever consulting company is around, which has got like 10 people in it. Not a good strategy. That's a kind of vendor lock-in that's basically like you're in a cult. You're basically in Waco, Texas, and like you're like behind the fence somewhere and you can't get out. So I think it could have worked out and it could have been, awesome, but it's okay to take risks like that as well. I think it gives you perspective. Then again, maybe it would have been a massive payoff, and then I would have said something totally different.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen people using more obscure languages, right? And they've been able to do some consulting where they've been able to knock things out really quickly. And so that, obviously for a boss, if you can do something in a short amount of time, that's one thing that they like. And so then they have followed on using their technologies, and then they're at the point where they're at a lock-in of technology, right? Where they basically have one provider, or I mean, in this case, there's probably 5 people locally who could help them with this project, right? And this was a good deal for the provider of that, because they were like, oh, we can charge whatever we want, right? Because we've got you, right?
Yeah. So if it's like, hey, Haskell, like this is another thing I've found that's a little bit scary about the high risk, high reward is, and you wouldn't do this in your own investment strategy either. Wouldn't put, like you said, Tesla is an interesting looking stock, but I wouldn't put all my money on Tesla because we just don't know what's going to happen. The same thing with, like Haskell, right? Like that's another one. I know people that are like, oh, Haskell's better than everybody. Haskell's so good. Hey, it looks interesting. I've done a little bit of stuff with Haskell, but there's a definitely like a delusional mindset where it's like, yeah, well, if it's not Haskell, it's not real coding, and then a lot of times the people that say that stuff, if you really get them into a situation where it's like, hey, we're supposed to be working here, this feature was supposed to be out 2 weeks ago, what happened? They're like, yeah, but they're not doing Haskell the right way. And then basically a lot of times what you'll hear with obscure languages is it's a great way to like get out of the responsibility of actually getting stuff done, because it's kind of like it's like yeah, but it's not like, you're not a true Scotsman. It's like this purity test where if you really dig into it, it's actually oftentimes what somebody that's very unproductive gravitates towards is like the most obscure technology, because then they can never be held accountable for not getting things done.
Yeah, and I think a lot also, a lot of engineers or software people, they like to build stuff, right? And so if you pick something new, you can be the king of the hill, but also you can decide how everything goes because there might not be a framework. So you get to roll your own, and you get to paint your own bike shed and make it whatever color you want. And so that might not be, a good high risk reward necessarily. I mean, I obviously biased, right? Because I sell snake oil for a living, but I think Python is a good, like, low risk investment right now. There's a huge demand for Python skills. You can do a lot of things with it, not just in the machine learning or data science side, but in the cloud side or the operations side, or if you want to make websites, you can do that as well. So I think that's sort of like kind of a no-brainer, right? I mean, if people are going to ask me what's a language to learn, I'd say, yeah, that's one that's obviously right now it's a good investment. Does that mean it will be a good investment 5 years from now or 10 years from now? It might not be, right?
But
I mean,
to your point, like maybe a more realistic high risk high reward language would be Swift, right? Where that one's interesting because it Apple created it. It's not as popular for mainstream programming as Python, but it's got some of the same characteristics. People are starting to maybe do a little bit of machine learning with it and Colab, and so that might be a more realistic than there's the zealotry approach, which is, yeah, if it's not Haskell, then it's not real code. And every single person I don't know, there are people that obviously do work in Haskell, but in general, as a gross generalization, every time I hear somebody talk about some zealotry type thing of like some obscure thing, it's oftentimes the sign of a very unproductive person, because it's like, well, what have you produced in this? Like, what production systems have you created? Oh, nothing. Okay, well, thank you. That's a great piece of advice you told me.
but it's a shiny object.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay. We got Mark Davis commenting here. He says, I know COBOL, which is good in the short term. I mean, that might be good in the short term and the longer term, right? I mean, that might be an investment that pays off on both sides right now. I mean, as someone who teaches people programming, I'm like, maybe that's something that I should learn, because there might be a market to teach people COBOL right now, just because as everything's going to pot, and these 50-year-old systems need to be used to keep people alive. Could be a good thing to do right now.
Yeah, that's it. That actually is. I like that one, which is you're basically kind of an opportunistic thing where that feels more like a good high risk reward, as well as like somebody's paying. There's a job offering for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 for like some really obscure technology, like that's legacy, like COBOL. That I like. I agree with you. I think that's a good bet. That's like, look, there's actually, it isn't like theoretically someone would do it. You could do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and Java and even Python might be there in a couple of years, right? This is sort of same thing. You got legacy systems that people want to work on the latest and greatest, but not these legacy things. Okay, I think we've probably got a minute for time for one more of these, and then we'll probably have to jump off. But there's the next one is investors try to buy low and sell high for maximum return. And so, what are your thoughts on that? How do you buy low, or how do you sell high? or maybe the reverse, right? Maybe you do something that you don't want to do.
Well, I will say this one reason I am very bored of Python. I mean, to be totally honest, it is just so boring because I've done it for so long. But one of the reasons I still use it is because I can literally work for 4 companies at the same time, and the productivity I have with cloud computing and Lambda functions is I can basically mastermind an entire company as a part-time job. And so I think that's the high, the
Yeah.
buy low, sell high, is that I can build something just super quick because of how boring it is. It just works, especially with, I think, serverless plus Python, if you're building distributed systems, is incredible. So that might be one example.
Yeah, that's awesome. Little investment, right? Huge payoff for that. And I think to your point, some of these more esoteric languages, right, where you're sort of just spending your time messing around rather than getting things done, that's sort of the opposite, right? Where a lot of investment, a little payoff.
Yeah, actually, I wrote an article about 10 years ago on using F# for Microsoft Developer Network, the magazine, and it took me a week to actually get all the code to compile and everything because it uses type inference and all this like tricky stuff. And I was just like, what is this doing? And that, even though in theory, once you looked at it, it looked good, it took a long time to get just like 30 lines of code working.
Yeah.
Anyway, sounds like we're ready to wrap this up. We both got to hop on our next thing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for chatting with me, Noah. Thanks for those who hopped in on the live with some questions and comments. We appreciate that. Hope to do this again soon. Again, if you're an audience and you have ideas or things you'd like us to talk about, feel free to reach out and we'll do that. Otherwise, have a great day and we'll talk to you later. Bye, Noah.
See ya.